Alright, for today's Critical Thought, we're going to be talking about storytelling in video games. And this is part of a conversation we had a few weeks ago live on the channel here with Ben Wander, who's currently working on the game A Case of Mistrust. By the time you're watching this video, the archive version of that talk should either be up or be coming real soon to the channel. But during that discussion, we talked about narrative-focused games, how they grew over the last decade, and why for a lot of people, especially traditional video game players, that it's very hard for us to get that emotional attachment to these characters or to the setting of these games. And as I thought about it more, I realized what kind of is the quote-unquote missing link of these narrative-based games. And it has to once again do with what is the player's investment in this game or in the situation. Now, traditionally, when we look at video games, or most of the standard games we've played, the investment comes in two distinct areas. The first is the gameplay investment. It's us spending 5, 10, 50 hours, whatever, with a character in this world. And one of the big things that has helped give us that investment in terms of survival horror games is wanting to see our main character, our hero heroine, get through that situation. Be it James Sunderland trying to survive Silent Hill, Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine in Resident Evil, and so on and so forth. We can even look at this in the action genre with characters like Nathan Drake, Ellie, and even crazy stuff like Dante, Kratos, Bayonetta, and the like. The point is, we have an investment built into these characters based on our interactions with them. It's watching them, do 50 to 100 hit combos in an action game, barely getting through a section with zombies or worse. Or even a simple investment in terms of survival like we saw with Alien Isolation. The point is, when it comes to that first big hook in terms of getting the player invested in a story, it is the gameplay, or what we're focusing on with that respective title. Now, the second point kind of evolves from that, is what's left after the mechanic investment, and that is the plot or the situation. If we've just spent 20 hours exploring this crazy world, or however long it took you to play through a Soulsborne game, naturally you'll probably have a few more questions about just what the hell happened. And that kind of interest really starts to delve into the lore, or more the backstory of these games. And for some of the more interesting or unique titles we've seen over the last 2 decades, this can create some very serious investment. For instance, after Killer 7 was done, there were many, and I do mean many, fan theories and plot investigations as to just what happened in that game. Soulsborne being another prime example, with many big videos of it here on YouTube of people trying to go through and just, round up all the various lore tidbits and try to make something we can process. And the point is, this happens after you've played through the game. And this was one of the understated beauties of Soulsborne. All that lore and all that backstory has very little to do with the gameplay itself. Imagine if things were front-loaded, that the second you turn on Dark Souls, you have to spend 2 hours watching videos of all the lore that's happened. It would be a completely different experience. But the lore is there as a backup to the gameplay. And this is why a lot of traditional games tend to hook people into that investment, because we're playing this world first before we learn more about it. And getting back to the narrative-focused games, this is where things are a lot harder to get into. Most narrative-based games, such as Gone Home, Dear Esther, and the like, tend to focus on the aftermath. The main story, or what's happened to this world or to these characters, has come and gone. We're essentially more a tourist, or it's voyeurism, compared to a traditional game. Like I said, going back to Silent Hill, we just spent 8 to 10 hours with James Sunderland exploring that town and trying to find his dead wife. So we have that investment in that character. Yes, we don't know what actually happens to her at the start, but we know we essentially have the place setting of what's happened in this world. We know James's wife is dead, we know he gets a mysterious letter from her, and we know we're heading to Silent Hill. And then everything else follows from that. But again, with narrative-based games, we're coming in at the tail end. We're essentially in the epilogue of these stories. Stuff like Tacoma or Firewatch. And it's very hard to build an investment beyond just the standard emotional beats. The problem is, and this is actually a question I want to ask you guys, especially if you are a developer who's worked on an independent game or a narrative-focused game. Why should I care about your character and situation when A, I am just getting into it at like the very end of the story? B, when this is over, I'm not going to see or hear from these characters ever again. And C, the plot itself I have no direct impact with. Again, I am more along for the ride rather than an active participant. And going back to what we just said a few minutes ago, with most traditional games, we're right there in the trenches with these characters. It's why people cared about Lara Croft in the Tomb Raider games or in the recent reboots. It's why we want to see Nathan Drake get through whatever crazy situation he's in. And of course, it's even why we care about Kratos when he smashed, his 100,000th head in God of War. But when it comes to narrative-based games, we can appreciate things at the surface layer. We can say, oh, we should feel for this character because they had a tough life, or we should care about this woman because her family passed away. But the problem is, it's just surface layer emotional attachment. Here's another great way to put it. It's like tuning into the series finale of a show and you've never watched any episode of it. For instance, a few years ago, my mom watched Breaking Bad, the series finale, after I told her all about the show, because she just wanted to see, the big ending of that. But she had no investment into that show beyond just watching that. So, yes, she got why Walter White was so-and-so, or why these characters were angry or sad. But in terms of the actual investment into the stakes that have happened on that show, she had no idea. And that's where I feel these narrative games tend to slip up on. Is that, yes, I'm going to feel sad or I'm going to feel, conflicted about a character due to their situation. But if I've never seen these characters before and I'm never going to see them after, why should I have any greater internal investment in them? And to give you an example of a game that managed to do that, and may actually be one of the first examples of a quote-unquote walking simulator, we have a prop this time, Rule of Rose. And yes, we talked about this in our discussion with Ben. And every time I bring up Rule of Rose, I of course have to mention, if you haven't heard the opening theme, definitely Google that or YouTube it, because it is a beautiful song. But Rule of Rose was a survival horror game that came out during the PlayStation 2 era. Very interesting story, but very rough gameplay. We're talking, again, that old school survival horror. Tank-like controls, isometric cameras, and a character who attacks by doing this. That's her whole attack animation there. And the game, like most survival horror games, focused a lot on its storytelling, the situation, and the characters. And what it did at the very end, and I'm talking, I think the main campaign was like 5 to 8 hours. I don't remember off the top of my head. But the very last chapter, or literally the epilogue, the game essentially turned into a walking simulator. You basically had free reign of the mansion, or the game space the environment that the game took place in. And you were free to walk around. There was no enemies, no cutscenes, no threats, anything like that. And the character basically tried to fill in all the holes in the story, or what her own thoughts were on these very specific situations. And once again, we just spent the last so-and-so hours with this character seeing things from the extreme and insane point of view. But now we're kind of given that chance to dial things down and focus more on the lore. And for me, it worked. I actually spent a good 30 minutes to an hour just wandering around trying to piece things together. And then once again, fans took that and ran with it. There were people who put out immense blogs trying to detail all the real life inspirations for Rule of Rose that were featured in the game. And this is, I think, the big point. Because Rule of Rose ended as a narrative-focused title. But we had that investment in terms of mechanics and the actual character development for the previous 5 to 10 hours. And when we, again, go back to most narrative-based games today, we're just given that epilogue, but nothing to really invest ourselves in. Now, for those of you who do get invested in these situations, more power to you. I don't want to seem like I'm denouncing or demeaning you. But for someone like me who grew up playing games where we had that hook, some kind of hook in these stories beforehand, it's just not there. And I know I'm going to piss people off when I'm about to say this next point, but when I think of a lot of the poor narrative-based games today, or the ones that just did not do it for me at all, it kind of feels like a narrative cheat. That again, we're supposed to care about these characters that we've never seen before, we're never going to see it again, and again, we have no connection in terms of the mechanics. And this is why some of the narrative-based games that have worked for me have had even just a very small gameplay hook to them. And of course, the two big examples would be Her Story and The Infectious Madness of Dr. Decker. Now, in both those games, once again, the player is still along for the ride. The story is not going to demand or not going to change completely based on what you do or what you don't do. But the player is the one who is pushing things forward. Again, with Her Story, it is just essentially a search engine. That's it. There's no cutscenes, there's no QTEs or anything like that. And with Infectious Madness of Dr. Decker, that is just a text parser. But because the player is the one who's doing it, it just puts it a little bit higher up for me on that scale compared to narrative-based games where it's just literally, here's a situation, you're just there for the ride. Get some popcorn, push forward, and you're done. And that's the weird thing, because I like to play games where I'm exploring like a ruined civilization or the aftermath of something, and we're trying to piece it together. The BioShock games, and of course recently with Prey, are really great examples of that environmental storytelling. But once again, we have an investment. Either it's a mechanic investment or a narrative-based one with these characters. And with something like Prey, for instance, the main character of Morgan Yu is not someone that we're supposed to relate to. They are essentially a surrogate for the player. And in my piece about serious storytelling, I talked about how a lot of the games that try to do things or do things well will typically ask the player to put themselves in this role. We are inhabiting the border guard in Papers, Please. We are inhabiting the robot or the cyborg in the Talos Principle. And it's more about, what do you think about the story? How do you feel investment in this situation? And again, this is done both through what the plot is and what the player is actually doing. And as I said in that previous piece, and we'll begin to wrap things up now, video games are an interactive medium. It is the beauty and the curse of what it means to tell a story in the video game industry. The player is both the user, or they're both the audience, and they're kind of a surrogate author, because the story should evolve based on what they're doing. Otherwise, you're just watching a movie, or you're reading a book, or seeing a TV show. And you have to have this investment. Now, of course, you can tell a story where the player has no real control. We've seen this with the adventure genre. But once again, we are helping these characters. We are with them in those trenches or in those crazy puzzles. So we're getting an investment that way. For instance, one of my favorite adventure series of the last few years will have been the Blackwell series by Watchet Eye. And again, I'm not doing anything to affect that story. I'm not going to change the ending. But because I'm with those characters and I'm helping them solve those puzzles, we're building an investment in that situation. So, with that said, let me know what you think about this. And for those of you watching this, what narrative-focused games managed to hook you with their story, and which ones didn't work for you? And again, if you can explain why, that would be great. And let me know what you think about this whole theory of trying to get an investment in the player. But with that said, thank you so much for watching today's video. Be sure to check back for daily streams around 10 Eastern, as well as daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. And if you'd like to suggest a topic for a future video, please get in touch. But otherwise, have a great day, and I'll see you all next time. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Check back around 10 Eastern for regular streaming. If you'd like to suggest games for me to cover or topics to talk about, let me know in the comments below. For a collection of my writings as well as weekly podcasts on design, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the Game Wisdom Patreon, you can find us on there on patreon.com/gwblaser. $1 will get you into our private Discord channel where we talk game topics and more. $5 will get you voting privileges for any major event, including the Saturday Night Grab Bag, Patreon-funded goals, and more. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you enjoy more videos here on the Game Wisdom YouTube channel.